Good afternoon and welcome to Hudson Institute. Thank you for joining us for this discussion on Venezuela. Delighted to see such an enthusiastic response. With the ongoing deployment in the Caribbean, the Trump administration is making it clear that we are in a new phase in how America is dealing with the Maduro regime. A new phase in which the administration intends to maintain a wider range of options in confronting the criminal threat emanating from Venezuela. For its part, the Maduro regime is not backing down, and right now it is conducting its own military maneuvers on the island of La Orquilla, about 150 miles north of the Venezuelan mainland. We have an outstanding panel today to examine the situation and assess this new approach from the administration and its prospects for success. David Smolansky was the mayor of the Caracas municipality of El Hatillo. He is the deputy director in Washington of Con Venezuela, the organization supporting Maria Corina Machado and President-elect Edmundo Gonzalez. Carrie Filippetti served as lead for Venezuela and Cuba at the Department of State during the first Trump administration, and currently is executive director of the Vandenberg Coalition. And lastly, Eric Farnsworth led the Washington, D.C. Office of Council of the Americas until very recently, is now a senior associate with CSIS. Thank you to each of you for coming, for joining this panel, for coming out on a Friday afternoon. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
Eric, I'd like to start with you to frame the discussion. Can you walk us through the events that have led to this renewed focus on Venezuela and lay out some of the opportunities and risks in this new approach?
Well, absolutely, Daniel. Thank you very much for the invitation to be back here at Hudson. It's a real privilege, and to join two really A-plus colleagues, Carrie and David. It's really a pleasure to join all of you, and thanks for coming out on a Friday afternoon, as was already mentioned. On July 28th, 2024, the Venezuelan people voted unmistakably for regime change. They did it freely and fairly, but actually not freely and not fairly, and they still prevailed. And what I mean by that is the administration of Nicolás Maduro had all the advantages of incumbency, of state resources, of media control, of reducing and then eliminating candidacies arbitrarily of leading candidates, namely Maria Corina Machado, of changing voter lists, of changing locations of votes, of polling places, and we could go on and on and on. And yet, the opposition did everything that the international community asked of them. They unified, they held primaries, they had a unified candidate who, once disqualified, then they had not one, but two new candidates, as each one continued got disqualified. They contested elections that most people thought they had no business doing because they didn't think they would win. And they came out on top overwhelmingly and publicly had the proof of doing so by revealing the vote counts that they were able to have on a quick count basis before the regime was able to organize, before the regime was able to promote its own fallacious vote counts, and before anybody was able to react in a way that was fraudulent. What happened was, not only did most observers not anticipate that the opposition would win, the regime didn't seem to think that the opposition would win, and the international community did not seem to think that the opposition would win. But because of that, there was no follow-up plan. There was no next day strategy. There was no, okay, the opposition has just won an overwhelming victory, completely unexpected, against all the odds. What happens next? And the international community seemed to have been taken by surprise. And in that vacuum entered into the Maduro regime, which quickly found its sea legs politically and came out with absurdly precise vote totals without revealing where they came from, the actus, which you've heard about in terms of never being seen and never being revealed, and immediately entered into a program of oppression and going after opposition leaders and also lay people to institute a real feeling of fear and concern among the Venezuelan people so that perhaps they would not be able to resist the regime's desire to remain in power. Nicolás Maduro re-inaugurated himself in January of this year, and at that time, just shortly thereafter, the United States had our own inauguration as well. How we got to where we are today is that the international community, the bottom line, the international community insisted that the opposition run an election, or contest an election, excuse me. Nobody thought they would win. The opposition won. The regime said, we're not going to allow the results to be implemented. Now what? And so the Trump administration has come into office saying, well, this is an illegitimate government, and it is in the US interest to begin to take stronger steps in support of democracy in Venezuela. As I mentioned right at the very beginning, the Venezuelan people voted for regime change, and I think that's very clear that what would be best for Venezuela, at least from my view, speaking as a non-Venezuelan, would be to have a democratically elected leader, a return to democracy, a return to open markets, and the opportunity for economic rebirth and regeneration. To the extent that the Maduro regime remains in place, that's extremely unlikely, but that's from the Venezuelan perspective. But I think being in Washington, we also have to ask the question, what's best for the United States? And as US policymakers are trying to think through what is it that the United States should do, that's a different question. It may be very much in parallel with Venezuela. It might diverge. There might be some nuance there back and forth. But that, I think, is precisely what's happening right now in terms of Washington, trying to define and discern what is in the US interest in support of democracy that will support US interests broadly. And I think, look, in the biggest sense, to have Venezuela free and prosperous and return to democracy, that is absolutely in the US interest. To say nothing of, if I can say, the interests of Colombia and Brazil and Peru and Ecuador and Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean countries and the countries, frankly, in Europe, where, like Spain, where Venezuela has intervened in elections and things like that. So this idea that Venezuela is only a problem for Venezuela, I think, is also something that we can see is not the case. It goes well beyond Venezuelan borders. The Trump administration has come into office continuing to support sanctions against leaders, increasing bounties on leaders. The bounty for Nicolás Maduro is now $50 million. So if anybody wants a quick $50 million, I can suggest how you can get that. I don't say it's easy, but it could be quick. But ramping up the bounty on the leadership of the regime, doing things to try to reduce Venezuela's activities in markets and sanctioning individuals and also markets. I think this is something that has been very much a continuation, if you will, of US policy from before. What's different is that the administration has now shifted the definition of drug trafficking, which the regime, I think, is clearly and unmistakably involved in and has been for years. And this is accepted on a bipartisan basis in the United States. The Biden administration recognized it, certainly others as well, but has changed the definition of drug trafficking now to terrorism. And with the change in definition, it may seem just like semantics, but it's not. It's fundamental, because what that does is it changes the authorities that the United States has to be able to address some of these very difficult issues. And the authorities under terrorism bring in a different ability to use military assets, a different sense of what is maybe appropriate in the environment, and how to go about conducting some of those issues. And so what we've seen is, for example, a rather large deployment, the largest in my view, or in my understanding, since the Operation Just Cause in Panama in 1989, a large military deployment in the Caribbean, which is now moving to Puerto Rico, Roosevelt Roads, and giving assets and the ability to have some options that might not just be impactful from the counter-narcotics effort, as we've seen already some of the boats being taken care of by kinetic activities, but could also be deployed in a different way as well. And I think this is the real question that's facing many in Washington. You have a large-ish, I mean, compared to the Middle East, no, but a large-ish buildup of military assets in the Caribbean. What are they there for? What can they be used for? What are they appropriate for? What's the fit to purpose? Do you need aircraft carriers to go after fast boats running cocaine? Do you need Marines to be able to do that? What's the purpose? And frankly, how long can they stay there before the cost-benefit analysis begins to weigh against you? So these are some questions that I think have to be addressed. So very quickly, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues for their thoughts, but this does provide a number of options for the United States if the U.S. is interested in going up the escalation ladder, which may or may not be willing to do, but it does provide some options. The first is to continue with the counter-narcotics mission. And as we've seen, the administration has very clearly indicated its desire and willingness to do that, and not just with Venezuela, but we've seen discussions. Secretary Rubio was just in Mexico, was just in Ecuador, and we've seen some of the rhetoric and some of the comments around highlighting and raising, amplifying is a better word, the counter-narcotics activities in the Western Hemisphere. But there are other possible options as well. One is to take the fight against counter-narcotics into Venezuela. Right now, it's outside of Venezuela. It's in the high seas. There are options within Venezuela in the context of using assets against, for example, drug labs or individuals. There are possibility to capture individuals and bring them to justice, maybe to get and bring outside of Venezuela to face international justice. And frankly, there are already cases at the International Court of Justice for Venezuelan leaders for crimes against humanity that have been brought, and Nicolás Maduro himself is under indictment in the United States, as are other regime officials. There's the possibility of a decapitation strike, which would go after regime officials. There's a possibility to take some territory in the country and install the democratically elected president, Edmundo Gonzalez. There are some other actions as well. I'm not predicting any of this. I'm not calling for any of this necessarily. I'm simply saying, to try to respond to Daniel's question, what are some of the options that the capabilities provide? And I think this is why some of the questions are becoming so prominent in the Washington space, because for the first time since Haiti in 1994 and Operation Just Cause in 1989, United States military looks to be perhaps actively involved in some of these issues in a way that they haven't been before. The last comment that I would make is that, again, looking from the US perspective, not the Venezuelan perspective, is it does seem to me that the use of military force, whether it's against counter-narcotics or in a different way, does require some sort of explicit authorization and would require some sort of explicit authorization. And so whether it's something from Congress, which I understand there's some actions that may be working there, whether it's resolution or activities at the OAS or the UN, I'm not saying it's likely or even possible in the current environments. But my point is there should be a meaningful authorization for legal activities in this way. And I know that people are looking at that in a very serious way and wanting to make sure that things are done appropriately, because you want them to be sustainable and replicable over time. So with that, let me simply conclude by saying it is a new day. There are new options. Will those options be utilized? We don't know. But in any event, what we're seeing right now is a departure, and it stems from that shift in definition from narcotics trafficking to counterterrorism mission.
Excellent introduction, Eric. Thank you. Thank you very much. Kerry, having been instrumental in the first Trump administration's policy toward Venezuela, how might the current team in the current administration be thinking about how this deployment fits into a larger Venezuelan policy? What might be the sort of longer-term strategic objectives here?
Yeah, one of the questions that I think a lot of people have been asking themselves, and it dovetails with this one, is this a drug trafficking op, or is this a regime change operation? Is this trying to get Maduro out of power, or is this just trying to counter narcotics trafficking in the region? And I think what's important to understand is the way that President Trump speaks about these things. Getting Maduro out of power is a counter-narcotics operation. So I actually think it is it's a false dichotomy to separate those two. What I'm referencing is President Trump has multiple times said, even during his campaign before he was president, he was talking about Venezuelan gangs, he was talking about Maduro and drug trafficking. This has been central to how he's been thinking about it. So it's not even so much this is his Venezuela policy, this is his Homeland Security policy. Secretary Rubio, same thing. When he was senator, he regularly referred to Nicolás Maduro, not specifically as a dictator, but as a narco-terrorist. He used this language multiple times well before he joined this administration. So it just goes to show the orientation of both of those senior leaders who are creating this policy. I think it's important, because I was in the first Trump administration, which did not pursue this particular approach, to understand why things are different now. Why is it that, as Eric laid out, we did decide to declare foreign terrorist organizations and so on? And I think there's a few different things, really four. One is we now have, we the US, experience trying to negotiate with the Maduro regime and having him not engage in good faith. This is something that very much disturbs President Trump. You can see it in his negotiations on Ukraine and Russia as well. He is constantly now bringing up the fact that Putin is an impediment to the peace process, and that results in him now agreeing to sell more military equipment to Ukraine, which was not something that he was necessarily predisposed to do in advance. So we've seen how over the course both of the first Trump administration as well as now the second administration already, these attempts at negotiation, Maduro keeps saying, I just want to talk. Well, we've been talking for a really long time, and you haven't done anything. And President Trump has always been very sensitive to this because he's the deal maker and he understands who's trying to obstruct a deal. The second major difference is there's an actual elected government in Venezuela, which makes this fundamentally different from how it was before. When Juan Guaido was leading Venezuela, that was a purely constitutional process. This, however, is unique because it was an actual election. So we know who the president of Venezuela is, and we know who the major opposition leader in Venezuela is. And that does make it different because that means that there is a entity that can step in that is not the US declaring that that's who it's going to be. There's not even a debate about that. And so that makes this fundamentally different as well. The third is, of course, Tren de Aragua and other Venezuelan gangs. Tren de Aragua, when I was working on Venezuela policy, it was an entity that we were aware of because of its prevalence inside Venezuela, but it wasn't really until 2023 that it started to expand well beyond and power project into the United States. We now have instances of their violence in Washington State, New York, Illinois, Utah, Colorado, Texas. This is why President Trump has been so emphatic about dealing with the Venezuela issue, because he is aware that, again, it is not just about what's happening, as Eric said, in Venezuela. It's what's happening here in the United States as well. So the rise of Tren de Aragua inside the United States is something that I think is driving this forward and why they declared a foreign terrorist organization. And then the fourth major difference is that the US, while not both within the context actually of Venezuela specifically because of the drone strikes on Venezuelan fast boats, but also within the context of, for example, Operation Midnight Hammer in Iran, the United States has made it very clear that we are not afraid to use precision strikes on entities that we think are a direct threat to American security. And I would argue that the Maduro regime and its narco-trafficking is much more of a direct, immediate threat to the United States, even than the Iranian nuclear program, though I do very much support that we use the strikes on that program as well. At the same time, Russia and China, which have been the sponsors of the Venezuelan regime, have demonstrated that they are not actually going to come in and rescue those leaders that the United States has decided to focus on. After Midnight Hammer, Russia and China did very little to help support the Iranian regime. And so this is something that I think if I were Nicolás Maduro, I would be thinking about all of these things. The fact that it is American direct security, this is a president who ran on a platform of making sure that he was protecting Americans, that he does not see a distinction between Maduro being out of power and protecting Americans from those narcotics, and that he's very willing to use precision strikes. These are things, and my allies, in Maduro's case, Russia and China, will not be willing to support me. That's something that I would start taking very, very seriously.
Carrie, those are very compelling points. Thank you. David, as a Venezuelan who has lived under this regime, can you describe the transformation of Venezuela into a criminal state, and talk about describe the relationship between Maduro and his regime and Cartel de los Soles and other criminal organizations?
Well, thank you, Daniel, for organizing and also institute this very important event for us. I think we have gotten to the point that we are finally speaking about the elephant in the room. Venezuelans have suffered since this century began from a very, very violent context. First of all, I will speak only about crime. Since 1999, so since Chavismo came to power, more than 500,000 Venezuelans have been killed because of crime. Venezuela has been one of the most violent nations, not only Latin America, but globally. And Caracas has been one of the most dangerous capital to live. Actually, the first migration outflow that came from Venezuela, that many people arrived in Miami or Madrid or Bogota, it was because of insecurity and crime. And part of that crime, the root cause of that crime was drugs and micro trafficking, not huge tons of drugs, micro trafficking, especially in the vulnerable areas. Then you have a country that impunity is a state policy. There's no access to justice. There's no rule of law. Every research that has been made on Venezuela, more than 90%, 95% of impunity. So criminals are protected, innocents are persecuted. And obviously, 25 years ago, Venezuela started to be, unfortunately, reference that how democracies used to destroy democracy, because Chavez was the one who started this. Chavez was the one who started the links with FARC, with ELN, that are now protected in Venezuela. It is estimated that ELN is at least in 15 states of Venezuela, and that started more than 20 years ago. So now, the elephant in the room is that Venezuela is run by a drug cartel. And 8 weeks ago, exactly 8 weeks ago from today, I think there has been a very important escalation that not only comes from the US, I have to say. First of all, Cartel de los Soles has been designated as a terrorist organization. So Maduro and Diosdado Cabello's regime have become the only with the Taliban to be in power and have that designation as a terrorist organization. This is mind-blowing when you think that Cartel de los Soles is treated as the same as the Taliban. Second, as my colleague said, the reward of Maduro is $50 million, highest ever in the US, twice Osama bin Laden, who was the responsible of the worst terrorist attack that has happened in the US, and probably the worst terrorist attack has happened in the world since this century began. Third, Latin American countries very fast have joined the designation of Cartel de los Soles as a terrorist organization. And I want to emphasize on this because this is very important. Ecuador has joined, Argentina, Peru, Paraguay, Dominican Republic, and Costa Rica. This is something unprecedented and happened very, very fast. And then, of course, you have now the special deployment on the Southern Caribbean, which I have to say that also France is participating, the Kingdom of the Netherlands is participating, and even nations like Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana are saying that they are committed to tackle transnational criminality. According to the DEA and International Transparency, 24% of the production of cocaine in 2024 went through Venezuela with total impunity. And the regime got $8.4 billion, with a B, $8.4 billion for drug trafficking last year, which is the equivalent of oil. But if you add other illicit economic activities, such as gold, human trafficking, or fuel smuggling, in a very, very conservative estimation, the regime is getting at least $13 billion on illicit economic activities. So in that sense, I totally agree with Secretary Rubio that when he says that it is a narco-terrorist organization running the country, and for me, this is the legal framework. I invite everyone who is here and everyone who is online. This is the indictment of the Southern District of New York of 2020. That if I may, just to quote here, under the leadership of Maduro and others, Cartel de los Soles sought not only to enrich its members and enhance their power, but also to flood the United States with cocaine and inflict drugs harmful and addictive effects on users in this country, and I quote. This was 5 years ago. So but we are not facing another Latin American dictatorship. We're not facing another Latin American caudillo. Probably we are the first nation in Latin America to be run under a drug cartel. And this is also impactful because there are many nations, or a few nations in Latin America that have been affected by drug cartels, but none of them have taken power, right? Like it's happening in Venezuela. When you see this indictment, you have Nicolás Maduro, who is the legitimate person in power, Diosdado Cabello, and Padrino Lopez, who is the Minister of Defense. So definitely this is the main pillar for them to stay power. And just to add also on the question on what Kerry was saying on the allies that the regime has had, I'm very hopeful and optimistic about the weakness that the regime allies are in this moment. Iran has been weakened since October 7th, 2023, of the terrorist attack with its proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas and its own regime. Russia obviously is under war with Ukraine after they brutally invaded Ukraine, and we'll always be supportive of the Ukraine people. That happened more than 3 years ago. And China has not given officially $1 to the regime since 2018. Having said that, I do not underestimate those three external actors because China has provided technology to the regime to implement social control. We've been told, for example, that now the jails where the political prisoners are, cameras have been installed, provided by China. Russia and Iran, you cannot underestimate them when both are the main arm and providers of the regime, the main military equipment provider of the regime. And then the other one that I did not mention on purpose is Cuba. That has been there, it has been in Venezuela since day one. And I think right now we need to understand that some people in the past thought that, well, if there is a change in Cuba, there's going to be change in Venezuela. Now it's the other way around. Cuba, Díaz-Canel depends on Maduro. They depend heavily on Maduro. By the way, they're having protests and problems internally like probably they didn't have since the special period in the 1990s. So if there is a democratic transition in Venezuela, as we are promoting, as we were, the people already decided regime change last year, July 28th, with an extraordinary combination that's going to be studied for years with Maria Corina Machado as a symbol of resistance, not only for Venezuelans. She has become a symbol of resistance globally, with the legitimacy of Edmundo González as the president-elect. If we get that democratic and orderly transition that we are promoting, I think we could see changes soon also in Cuba and Nicaragua.
Thanks, David. Eric, as you know, David mentioned that the several governments in the region following the U.S. lead, designating Cartel de los Soles as a terrorist organization. Not only that, during the next year, there will be several elections in the region that could significantly change the makeup of governments in the region. Could we see, with these elections, could we see a different panorama in the region that could shape events in Venezuela in a different direction?
I think it's a really interesting question, a really good point. The two countries I think that are fundamental in this discussion, besides the United States and Venezuela, obviously, are neighbors Colombia and Brazil. And both have democratically elected governments right now that are skeptical, let's put it that way, of stronger actions with reference to Venezuela. Both countries have elections pending next year. And look, it's too early to predict who's going to be elected president in either of those countries, or in Chile, or in Honduras, or in Costa Rica, or any of the other countries that are seeing elections. We just saw what happened in Bolivia, for example. But you could without too much, fantasizing, I suppose, you could think about a different alignment of politics in the region that would be more favorable toward direct actions in terms of isolating the Maduro regime, that would be in favor, for example, of stronger steps, whether it's on individual sanctions or isolation or what have you. It's hard to isolate a regime if the neighbors aren't working with you to do that, and it's just by definition. And I think it's a much more sustainable policy to be able to do it, whether it's in Latin America or Asia or Africa or wherever it might be, but a policy that is perceived and is more than just a perception, is in reality supported by actively allies and friends in the region in a unified way. And this is the point I think David was making so well. I mean, look at the countries that have already come out in reference to Cartel de los Soles, right? I mean, this is a diverse group of countries around the Western Hemisphere which have designated the cartel as a terrorist organization. And that is the type of regional solidarity that I think one has to take a look at. The point that often comes up in these conversations is, well, Latin America is opposed to this or that, right? First of all, Latin America is more than just, it's a very diverse region. But, this isn't the same Latin America from the 1960s, the 1970s. I mean, some of these countries are countries that themselves face some of the issues Kerry was talking about, internal disruption and criminal activities based on cartel activities that affects not just elites and business community, but people at the street level. And people are just frankly tired of it and sick of it. So the idea that somebody is going to try to address some of these issues, I think is very appealing to folks in the region in a way that perhaps it wasn't in the past. And we see election after election decided on some of these issues. So I think that's a really important point. The electoral calendar, that's why people vote. You don't know who's going to be elected, so it could be a different one. It could be, it's hard to predict. But I do think it's a very relevant question to ask.
Good. Kerry, you mentioned the sort of tepid response from China so far. Sort of zooming out even a little more, how should we think about events in and around Venezuela in terms of China and Russia and sort of great power competition in Latin America?
Yeah, I would say, so there's two ways that I would answer that. The first is that President Trump has obviously alluded to the role of some of these countries in Latin America during this administration, most especially as it relates to Panama and China's influence within the canal there. But broadly speaking, I think President Trump seems to be oriented towards this, as I said, more as a homeland security, sort of almost a broadening of like his domestic concerns about American security, than seeing it within the context of great power competition. So I just say that to suggest great power competition does, in my view, have a significant role. I don't think that's necessarily what's motivating the president in his determination to send assets to the Caribbean. Look, China and Russia have for decades been huge spoilers in the region. I think they're doing it for different purposes. My understanding, based on Russia's behavior, is that it's largely there to antagonize the United States. It's there to be a thorn in our side, to be, within our the hemisphere that we belong to. And so I think they're almost like a chaos agent in a sense in the hemisphere. Of course, they've also had a significant role to play within the Venezuelan oil industry as well. But I think that's sort of part and parcel of the chaos agent moniker. China, of course, as David mentioned, one of the things that I'm most concerned about is how China supports illicit regimes and authoritarian regimes with things like their technology in order to, this was done in Iran as well during the women life freedom protests. A lot of the technology that was identifying the women that were removing their hijabs was Chinese in origin, and then that was used to identify the women and put them in prison or kill them as well. And that's technology that they send to Latin America. They send it to Maduro. We know that there have been training exercises between the Russians as well as the Venezuelans, the Cubans as well as the Venezuelans as well. So ultimately, we do see great power competition at play here. It's why, when I was in the first Trump administration, there were many who were surprised that President Trump cared so much about Venezuela. Who were in the administration, they would say, we don't understand, what's the American interest here? Obviously, as I already laid out, there's a huge American interest as it relates to drug trafficking. But as I said, the first administration, that wasn't as dominant. And the reason is because, A, Russia, China, and Iran are very much present there. They're also present there for their anti-American propaganda. The Iranian Broadcasting Service has Spanish language outlets. Sputnik, Mundo, and Russian services are some of the most widespread messages on Twitter and social media within the region, and they're often spreading anti-American propaganda. So when we think about why America matters, or why Venezuela matters to America, it's not just the drugs, it's also the fact that Russia, China, and Iran are there. And so that's always been a key component of how I've thought about the U.S. interest. Of course, there's also the U.S. interest in, broadly speaking, democracy, human rights, and so on. This is something, obviously, language that isn't used quite as often in this administration as it has been in previous administrations. But it's because there are so many different competing interests as to why America cares about the future of Venezuela and the Venezuelan people.
Thank you. David, there's been the response from the Maduro regime to the deployment seems improvised. There's been several different measures, including the military exercises taking place right now. One of those measures is mobilizing a Bolivarian militia. The regime claims to have mobilized an additional 8 million, and to now have over 12 million Venezuelans that have signed up for this militia. Obviously, we have to take these things with a grain of salt. But what are you hearing from Venezuelans about what they are seeing, how they see the regime responding, and what it means for conditions in Venezuela?
Well, first of all, if the regime had that people, they would have won last year, right? They lost 70-30. And 70-30 under those circumstances, because if we had a free and fair election, we would have won 90-10. I think people in Venezuela are hopeful. Sometimes there's this propaganda that says that, external actors are intervening Venezuela and so on. We're facing a criminal regime that has caused 8.5 million people who have fled the country, largest migration and refugee crisis in the world, above Syria and Ukraine, that has caused that 7 million people, as we speak, cannot eat 3 times a day, which is the largest population in the Western Hemisphere and 4th largest in the world, only compared with nations like Afghanistan and Yemen. It is a regime that, as we speak, has over 1,000 political prisoners, and today, Friday afternoon, some of them are being heavily tortured, psychologically and physically. They have been the responsible, as I said at the beginning, of more than 500,000 Venezuelans who have been killed because of crime, because they have provided protection to gangs and mega gangs. TDA now is everywhere here in the news. We've been hearing about the TDA since I was 20-ish, right? The first migration outflow, as I said, fled because of crime and people who were victims of kidnapping, murder of gangs like TDA and among others. And obviously they have destroyed our economy, they have destroyed our oil industry. So Venezuelans are hopeful. Venezuelans support when other nations are with us, fighting for democracy, fighting for freedom, fighting for a democratic transition. As I said, it's the US, it's Canada, it's the UK, it's the EU, is the majority of the nations in Latin America, is even nations like Korea, Australia, Japan, Israel, Morocco, that are with us. And the change in Venezuela, a democratic transition in Venezuela, an orderly transition in Venezuela, will not only be beneficial for Venezuelans, it will be highly beneficial for the entire region. And we are ready for that. We are ready to take control of the government. We are ready to govern. We are ready to create the conditions for investment. We are ready to create the conditions to have many who have fled to go back and be part of the rebuilding. We are ready to have a reinvention of our judicial system, the capacity building for our police, and having a police that is not politicized, but is a police that's for protect the people. We have so many Venezuelans talented, not only in our country, but everywhere, that what they want is to serve to our nation and be part of that transition. Anytime, there has been 97 sanctions after July 28th, 97 individual sanctions after July 28th, from the UK, Canada, European Union, and the US. Anytime that an individual sanction is imposed, beyond what it represents to the person who is sanctioned and its inner circle, moralize the people. In a country where you don't have access to justice, and then you listen in the news that, oh, there's an individual sanction to Diosdado Cabello that the US or other is implementing. People feel in a country that you don't have access to justice, well, we are not alone. Anytime there is a statement about human rights violations and asking for the release of political prisoners, the victims there do not feel alone. So we don't see this problem isolated. It is a Venezuelan-led movement, of course. We decided already for regime change. We have done a lot of sacrifice, but the thing that Maduro, Diosdado, and Padrino are doing go beyond our borders, and they cannot keep behaving as impunity is forever.
Eric, you mentioned this, you mentioned a sort of a ladder of options that the administration might turn to. Could you elaborate a little on that and sort of describe some of the scenarios that we might see, depending on how the administration decides to proceed with force projection in the region?
Yeah, it's a tough question because capabilities and intent are two separate things, right? So, but I think based on, and quickly, because this could be a full conversation, but the capabilities that are currently in place, I don't think anybody would suggest that that's an invasion force, which I think is probably pretty straightforward. It is a force that's also probably too heavy for a strictly counter-narcotics interdiction mission. It's not to say it couldn't do that, doesn't do that, won't do it, won't continue that, but it's a force structure that's built for more. You don't send F-35s to take out fast boats, at least you didn't used to. So the question is, within those metrics, there are a whole lot of different options. I think right now what we have not seen, Kerry has indicated a different approach in terms of a casus belli, which is to say that drug trafficking against the United States is an act of war or an act of aggression, let's put it that way, against the United States. And I think that is the key question that's being litigated right now, not litigated in courts, but in the court of public domain. Because to this point, we haven't seen, for example, an invasion of Guyana or some sort of attack on US interests, like a sinking of a boat or something like that. And that would be the normal thing that would set off some sort of a military activity. I was in the State Department back in the 1990s. I worked in government. My first activity at the State Department was in the Panama office, and so I know the Panama example very well. And there's oftentimes a discussion of, is Venezuela like Panama? And the short answer is not really. And part of that is because and there are other reasons too. But part of that, there was a direct, not just attack, but killing of U.S. forces that Manuel Noriega did, of U.S. forces who were stationed in Panama. U.S. soldiers were dying, and there was a threat that more could die. And there were other things as well. But there was and Noriega also declared war on the United States for reasons that nobody quite understood. But there was a casus belli. There was a reason for George H.W. Bush to take the decision he did. I think most observers would suggest that those conditions don't currently exist with Venezuela. So and I don't think Mr. Maduro is stupid. He knows the red lines. So the question is, within that construct, within that context, what actions do you take to support democracy, to address the narcotics issue, to support U.S. interests in all these things? I think there is one scenario that I did not mention at the beginning, which I probably should have, but could be the most likely one based on the force structure that currently exists. And that's basically not just interdiction of narcotics, but economic interdiction. So for example, the whole ghost fleet issue that Kerry and her colleagues in the first Trump administration were so active on in terms of resisting the illegal sale and export of the national patrimony, frankly, the Venezuelan crude to other sources that was sanctioned by the United States, but it was being exported around the world. Those policies were reduced or even eliminated by the Biden administration for whatever reason. But the point is that you need enforcement capability. And to the extent now you're dealing with either Russian ships or Chinese ships or somebody else's ships, a U.S. guided missile destroyer is a lot more effective in that way than perhaps a Coast Guard cutter. So, I mean, I think you do have some options along those lines. I'm not predicting the result here because I honestly don't know. I'm simply saying that based on the rhetoric that we're hearing, based on the shifting conditions, based on the force structure, based on, frankly, how Mr. Maduro and his regime seem to be spiraling into just complete oppression and chaos, you do have some different options and a different escalation ladder here than you might have had in the past.
Thank you. Kerry, you noted Maduro's disinterest in negotiating, and is that something at some point have felt the pain and have decided to negotiate on topics that they thought were non-negotiable? Could we see a similar change of heart with Maduro?
Well, I think that could be one of the intended purposes as well, to demonstrate that there is a consequence for a continued intransigence. But President Trump is frequently open to real negotiation. It seems to be his core priority. As David has mentioned multiple times, the objective for the Venezuelan opposition, as I understand it, is a peaceful and orderly transition to the democratically elected leader. They have not called for an invasion. President Trump has not called for an invasion, but what he's doing is making it very clear of what the consequences could potentially be, as Eric laid out, if Maduro decides that he's going to continue doing what he's doing, both in terms of drug trafficking, both in terms of continuing to operate in conjunction with these cartels, in terms of his violations of human rights and democratic freedoms in Venezuela. And so my assumption would be that if Maduro said, you know what, this is a door that I would be willing to look at, I think President Trump would be open to it if he actually engages in good faith. And that's the big if. That's something that he's never done before. But as I pointed out in my opening remarks, this is a very, very different scenario for Maduro than it was in the first administration. In the first administration, we were not primarily looking at Venezuela as a drugs affecting Americans issue. Now we are. And that shift, along with the other shifts that I mentioned, means that Maduro is not going to be able to string along the administration the way that he tried to string along the Biden administration or the first Trump administration. So from my perspective, I think getting a peaceful and orderly transition is the #1 priority. But in order to get there, I think Maduro needs to really understand that there is a real consequence here. And he's seeing how seriously President Trump is taking it through the actions in the Caribbean right now.
Good. We have time for a few questions from the audience. So if anyone has a question, there is a mic, and feel free to
Only
engage.
nice questions, only easy questions.
There's one in the back.
Softball questions.
Thank you. My name is Carlos Rodriguez Lopez. I'm a Venezuelan too. I know Mr. Smolansky. I wanted to ask you because you said that it was estimated that the Venezuelan government is racking up around $13 billion in illicit business. And a very significant portion of that Venezuelan government are high-ranking military members. So my question is for the panel, if the United States does not put boots on the ground, how do you expect the military to turn against Maduro when they have such illicit incentive and a possible opposition government will be a threat to their corrupt way of living? Thank you.
Well, very good question. I would like to start that Venezuela is a very important point that you mentioned on the armed forces because Venezuela has at least 2,000 generals. That's more than the whole NATO. Having said that, the middle and low rank officials, they want to change like many Venezuelans. Obviously, these type of strategies that are sensitive are not to share here in this type of conference. But what I can tell you is that there are frictions and tensions within the regime, more specifically on the armed forces. And that is why I said at the beginning of this event that we are finally speaking on the elephant in the room. Because on this operation against drug trafficking, the main income that the regime is receiving and the main beneficiaries are these 2,000 generals are starting to get very low. And with that, tensions, frictions, people who want to collaborate, like some of them have started to do. And with that, we hope, again, that we can finally have a democratic and orderly transition. And part of the rebuilding process that we need to have in Venezuela is definitely we need armed forces that are completely institutional. We don't want any more armed forces that are completely politicized, armed forces that are for everything. You see armed forces in Venezuela that run companies, expropriate, sell chicken, run for governor, run for mayor. We want our armed forces to protect the people, to protect the territory, to protect our borders, and that's it. Enough we have had with a history of military. It's the moment for civilians in Venezuela.
Rick?
Very briefly, does whatever happened in Panama with Mr. Noriega, does that have anything to do with the current situation? I mean, we had a situation there, it was handled differently. The United States did not take over Panama. The United States took the problem out of Panama. The other one is, I'm surprised no one has said anything about Mexico. What's the situation with the Mexican government in the middle of this whole thing?
Well, I'll quickly reprise the Panama issue. And as I mentioned, I was directly involved in some of those activities back in the wake of Operation Just Cause. Panama had, as you recall from the time, a large number, about 25,000, 27,000 US troops garrisoned in the country already. We knew the country really well for 100 years. We had been stationed there, we ran the canal, et cetera, et cetera. And the Noriega regime, which had been indicted for drug trafficking out of the Southern District of Florida, was starting to radicalize and starting to target US citizens and US service members. And one was actually killed, others were harassed. But at the same time, under the Panama Canal treaties, we were obligated, the United States was obligated to turn over the canal to Panamanian ownership by the end of 1990. I think I have that date correct. But in any event, 10 years after they were signed. The Bush administration made the strategic determination they did not want to turn over a windpipe of the US and global economy to an indicted drug trafficker. And so that was the timing issue, but there was a strategic asset there as well. And then there was the casus belli in terms of the targeting of US service members and that sort of thing. It was a different time, it was a different place. Panama is 1/10 the size of Venezuelan territory. And you didn't have in Panama, like you do have in parts of Venezuela, you didn't have FARC and ELN guerrillas running around, you didn't have the illegal miners. So it's just a different circumstance. That's not to say that that should impact or not impact Venezuelan options. That's not my point. But my point is that it's not a one-for-one, well, we did it in Panama, therefore, right? So I think it's a different scenario. And I think somehow it was, I use this word cautiously, but easier in Panama for some of those reasons. And you also had in 1989, remember December 1989, coming out of the Cold War, that was the first post-Cold War conflict. Russia was actually not an adversary in that way that they would be now in the Venezuela context and everything else. So I just think there's a different scenario there. In terms of the Mexico issue, I'll let Carrie answer that one, or David. But it is an interesting comparison. I just think it has to be a little bit carefully, unpacked.
In terms of the Mexico question, I think this is why partially I say that it's not cut and dry. Is this a get Maduro out of power operation, or is this a counter-narcotics operation? Because the deterrent and chilling effect that I would suspect these drone strikes on Venezuelan fast boats has had, not just in Venezuela, but I think the administration's purpose is that it has a deterrent effect also in Mexico, where, of course, as we know, the vast majority of drugs, the vast majority of fentanyl is coming into the United States. So, and it's not out of the blue, right? I mean, we've heard members of Congress, Republican members of Congress over the last couple of years speaking about an AUMF in Mexico, for example. So it's something that the Republican Party seems to have really gotten behind, this idea of we need to take more efforts. As we're addressing illegal immigration across the border, we also need to be much more serious about addressing the supply side of the drug issues in the United States. So that's why I see them as very closely linked together. That the Mexican cartels hopefully are seeing what's going on with the international waters and worried about what would happen if they continue to traffic drugs into the U.S.
I think that demonstration effect is really important. I'm glad you raised it.
I would just add that it has made even more epic the democratic movement when the two giants of Latin America have not been totally aligned with us, Mexico and Brazil. And I'm not even speak about Colombia. But we are open as soon as the transition begins to have the best diplomatic and economic relations with different nations in Latin America. But as a Venezuelan, I feel very proud that despite not having the biggest economies and biggest nations in Latin America with us completely, we are almost there.
This is if I can just really quickly say, but this is a really important point, David. The idea that, in Venezuelan reconstruction, there is massive opportunity.
It is.
Not just for Venezuelans, but for international investors, et cetera. And the project that Maria Corina Machado has made public, I mean, the video I've seen, it's all over the YouTube, et cetera, or all over YouTube. But it is impressive, the goals and the vision and the ambition. And it's always struck me as a little bit odd, frankly, that some of the folks who have assets right now in Venezuela, that sort of thing, are looking to try to, deliver benefits through the current regime, when in fact, if there was a democracy that returned to Venezuela, their upside is limitless. Bondholders and folks like that. It's like, why are you betting on this wrong horse? In my view, and okay, there's a lot of pragmatism, I guess, and cynicism maybe, and is Maduro ever really going to go? And we should deal with the situation on the ground as we have it, not as we want it to be, or any of that stuff. I get that, but at the end of the day, if you really want to succeed economically in the Venezuela scenario, it's the country with the largest proven reserves of oil in the entire world.
8th largest gas, 12th largest gold.
Gold, critical materials, critical minerals, it's extraordinary. And nobody's talking about this. I mean, and this is, to me, it's always been a kind of a strange oversight. It's like this country is extraordinarily wealthy. Of course, the Venezuelan people need to be the first recipients of the wealth of their own country, et cetera. But I mean, I think there is a real opportunity here that goes well beyond even the issues we've been talking about. But you touched on, I just wanted to really highlight that point, because the work that you've done, the work that the opposition, that Maria Corina, that Edmundo have done is just extraordinary on that front.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Important point. Thank you. We have time for one last question. And if not, I'm going to go to David for final thoughts.
Well, Eric almost did the end, but I just want to emphasize that Venezuelans have been through so much during these 26 years, and I already shared part of the obstacles that we have faced during this century on criminality, on migration, on the destroyer of the economy. But I think since 2023, there has been the most hopeful chapter during these 26 years. It has been really epic. First of all, we had a primary that against every odds, Maria Corina Machado was elected. And when I say against every odds, because many people, even including in the opposition, that they are so-called opposition trying to implode that process, and against repression and social control, she was elected the Democratic leader of the opposition. Maria Corina Machado has behaved as a state woman. She was not elected as a candidate. She was elected to be the leader of this process, and she was, when I say state woman, is at the moment that she was illegally banned for running. That's when Edmundo Gonzalez came to the stage. No one knew who was Edmundo Gonzalez, but the role of the diaspora, the role of that 8.5 million people through WhatsApp, X, and Instagram, in a matter of days and weeks, sent messages and pictures of Edmundo Gonzalez, and everyone in Venezuela knew who was Edmundo Gonzalez. And even though he was in a voting card, only one face of him and 15 faces of Maduro, among others, to confuse, 7 million people voted for Edmundo Gonzalez, and we have a president-elect, and we have, as I said at the beginning, a Maria Corina Machado, who has become not only a symbol of democratic and freedom resistance in Venezuela or in Latin America, but globally. We're ready to govern. We're ready for the transition. We're ready to have an orderly and democratic transition in Venezuela. We're ready to create the conditions to have Venezuelans back, starting from the ones who are in the US. We have this economic program that we have presented, the 1.7 trillion opportunity that Venezuela represents. We are ready to depolitize the armed forces, the police. We're ready to work with our natural allies, not with Iran, but with the US, not with Russia, but with Ukraine and the EU. We're ready to be back in Latin America as a nation that leads for democracy, for freedom, for economic prosperity. So that's what we want. We don't want to be opposition forever. I don't want to be in exile forever. We want to go back, be part of the transition, be part of a new chapter of democracy, and with that, the next generations can have a different country than the one that we have had during these 26 years. Thank you.
Thank you, David. On that hopeful note, I want to bring this to a close, and I'd like to thank our panelists, Eric, Carrie, and David, for sharing their insights. I think you provided some extremely lucid analysis and some very, I think, important points that we need to bear in mind. And I want to thank our audience for coming today. Have a great weekend.